My mother left me a voicemail telling me not to come back, and I believed her. I spent one quiet night accepting that my family had chosen control over love. By morning, my phone showed 46 missed calls and messages begging me to return. What changed overnight wasn't my decision, it was their fear of losing me forever. Before I begin, if you've ever lived through family rejection or betrayal like this, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to Story Flow Diaries. Your stories and support remind people like me that we're not alone. This is a mother told me not to come back story, and I wish I could say I was shocked when it happened, but the truth is, it felt like the final sentence in a book I'd been reading my whole life. I had just finished a late shift, my feet aching, my mind foggy, when my phone vibrated in my pocket. One new voicemail. No missed calls before it. No warning. Just her name on the screen. My mother. I stood outside my apartment building, keys cold in my hand, and listened to her voice echo through the night air. It was calm, almost polite the way she sounded when she'd already made up her mind. She said my name once, then said, "Don't come back. If you leave like this, don't bother coming home again." No yelling, no tears, just a click at the end that felt louder than any scream. I remember staring at the phone for a long time, as if it might explain itself if I waited. That was the mom voicemail don't come home moment that would later become the voicemail that changed my life. But at the time, it felt strangely familiar. Growing up, love in our house was always conditional. You were praised when you followed the plan, scolded when you questioned it, and iced out when you stepped too far outside the lines. I had learned early that silence was her favorite punishment, so when she said, "Mother said don't come back," part of me thought, of course, this is how it ends. I grew up believing my family was close. That's what we told people. On the outside, we looked like a unit that valued tradition, respect, and loyalty. Inside, everything revolved around obedience. My mother ran the house like a quiet commander. She never needed to raise her voice. A look was enough. My father stayed in the background, nodding along, avoiding conflict, letting her lead. I was the eldest daughter, which meant I was the example. I learned to read her moods before I learned to drive. I learned which dreams were acceptable and which ones were considered selfish. I learned that independence was praised in theory but punished in practice. The night she left that voicemail, I had finally crossed a line I'd been dancing around for years. I had told her I was moving out for good. Not in anger, not dramatically, just a calm statement of fact. I had saved enough money, found a small place, and decided I wanted to live my own life without reporting every decision. I thought, foolishly, that because I was calm, she might be too. Instead, she listened in silence, said she needed time, and hung up. Hours later, that voicemail arrived. Family abandoned me story. That's what it became, even though at the time I didn't have the words for it. I went inside my apartment and sat on the edge of my bed. I replayed the message once more, then again, until the words lost their shape and became just sound. I thought about calling her back, about apologizing for wanting something as basic as independence. But something inside me was tired of begging, tired of shrinking. I remembered all the times I'd gone back on my own needs to keep the peace. I remembered how temporary that peace always was. So I did something I'd never done before. I didn't call back. I put my phone face down on the nightstand and lay down fully clothed, staring at the ceiling. Sleep didn't come easily. My mind replayed memories like scenes from an old movie, being told which friends were acceptable, which clothes were appropriate, which career paths were respectable. I thought about the first time I tried to set a boundary and how it had been labeled as disrespect. I realized that this wasn't just one argument. This was years of control tightening every time I tried to breathe. This was an emotional mother-daughter story that had been building quietly, waiting for one moment to break open. At some point in the night, I felt a strange calm settle over me. It wasn't happiness, it was acceptance. If this was the price of choosing myself, then so be it. I whispered into the dark that I would survive. That sentence felt rebellious and sacred at the same time. I turned my phone off, not of spite, but because I needed one night without being pulled back into the gravity of their expectations. When I woke up the next morning, sunlight spilled across the room, and for a split second everything felt normal. Then I remembered. I reached for my phone, more out of habit than hope, and turned it on. It buzzed immediately, then buzzed again and again until it felt like it might vibrate right off the bed. 46 missed calls, dozens of messages. My heart started pounding, not with relief, but with disbelief. This was the parent's regret after kicking me out moment, though I didn't recognize it yet. I just stared at the screen, my mother's name repeated over and over, mixed with my father's, my aunt's, even a cousin I barely spoke to. The first message from my mother was short, "Call me." The next was longer, "We need to talk." Then the tone shifted, "Please." By the 10th message, the voice notes began. Her voice was different now, unsteady, tearful. She said she hadn't slept. She said she was worried. She said she didn't mean it like that she was just upset, that I shouldn't take things so seriously. Each message felt like a wave crashing against a door I had just closed. Mother begged me to come back, but even as she begged, she never quite apologized. I didn't listen to all of them right away. I couldn't. I put my phone down on the nightstand and went to make coffee, my hands shaking. This was the family rejection then regret cycle playing out exactly as it always had, just louder this time. I realized something uncomfortable as I stood there staring at the coffee maker. They hadn't missed me because of me as a person. They panicked because I hadn't come back on my own, because the script had changed. Later, when I finally sat down and listened to every message, I noticed a pattern. She talked about how the family looked without me, how my absence raised questions, how people were asking where I was, how it wasn't good for us to be divided like this. It was a toxic family regret story unfolding in real time. The regret wasn't about hurting me, it was about losing control, about the image cracking. My father left one message, quiet and awkward. He said, "Your mother's very upset. You know how she gets. Just come home and we'll forget this ever happened." Forget. That word landed heavier than anything else. Forget that she told me not to come back? Forget the nights I cried myself to sleep feeling like I was never enough? Forget the years of walking on eggshells? It was then that I understood this was an estranged child family story in the making, whether I went back or not. I sat on my bed again, phone in my lap, and felt two emotions wrestling inside me. One was the familiar pull of guilt, the instinct to fix everything by sacrificing myself. The other was new and fragile, but stronger than I expected. It was self-respect. I thought about how quiet my life had been without the constant commentary, how the silence, painful as it was, had also been peaceful. I thought about the phrase, "when parents choose control over love," and how clearly it applied to my life. I didn't call back that morning. I needed time to understand what I was feeling without their voices shaping it. I texted one line instead. "I need space. I'll talk when I'm ready." It felt like stepping on unfamiliar ground, shaky but solid. The calls didn't stop immediately, but they slowed. Each vibration reminded me that the power dynamic had shifted, even if they didn't realize it. That day marked the beginning of a long, complicated healing process. It wasn't dramatic or clean. There was no instant closure, but it was the first time I chose not to abandon myself to keep others comfortable. This emotional, real-life family regret story didn't resolve overnight. It unfolded slowly, painfully, honestly. And as I looked at my silent phone that evening, I knew one thing for certain. Whether I went back or not, nothing would ever be the same again. The silence after I sent that message felt heavier than the argument itself. I kept expecting my phone to light up again, for my mother to ignore my boundary the way she always had. But instead, there was a pause, like the whole family had stopped breathing at once. That pause gave me too much room to think. I replayed my childhood in fragments, moments that never seemed important enough to question before. Times when my opinions were dismissed with a smile. Times when my accomplishments were celebrated publicly but minimized privately if they didn't align with her expectations. I started to see a pattern that went beyond one voicemail. This wasn't just about me moving out. This was about years of control disguised as concern. By the afternoon, my aunt called. She didn't leave a voicemail, just texted, "Your mother is worried sick. You know she didn't mean it. Come home and make things right." That phrase, "make things right," had followed me my entire life. It always meant one thing: apologize, even if you didn't do anything wrong. I stared at the message and felt something tighten in my chest. For the first time, I asked myself a question I'd never allowed before. What if making things right didn't mean going back? What if it meant finally telling the truth? I decided to take a walk to clear my head. The air outside was crisp and the city felt indifferent in a way that was strangely comforting. No one here knew my family drama. No one expected me to perform a role. As I walked, I thought about how often I'd been told that family is everything. But no one ever talked about what happens when family hurts you and refuses to take responsibility. This was the heart of my family turned their back on me story time, even if they didn't see it that way. That evening, my mother finally sent a longer text. She said she felt disrespected. She said she had sacrificed everything for me. She said I was being ungrateful. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "I'm sorry if what I said hurt you." I read that sentence over and over. Sorry if, not sorry for. It was a familiar non-apology, one I'd accepted countless times before. But this time, something inside me refused to swallow it. I typed out a response and deleted it 3 times before sending it. I told her calmly that the voicemail hurt me deeply, that being told not to come back felt like being erased. I told her I needed space to heal and that I wouldn't come home until we could talk honestly, without threats or guilt. My hands were shaking when I hit send. I half expected an explosion. Instead, hours passed with no reply. That night, memories came back in waves. I remembered being 17 and wanting to attend a university in another city, only to be told that good daughters don't move far from home. I remembered ending a relationship because my mother disapproved, even though she'd never met him. I remembered the constant fear of disappointing her, how it had shaped every decision I made. This emotional mother-daughter story wasn't just about conflict, it was about identity. Who was I without her approval? The next morning, my father called again. His voice was tired, worn down by years of mediating without ever choosing a side. He said my mother hadn't eaten, that she was crying, that the house felt empty without me. I listened quietly, then asked him something I'd never dared to ask before. I asked if he thought it was okay for a parent to tell their child not to come back. He went silent. When he finally spoke, he said, "She didn't think you'd take it seriously." That answer hurt more than any insult. It confirmed what I had suspected. They never thought I'd actually leave. They thought the threat would pull me back into line. After we hung up, I sat with that realization for a long time. Parents cut me off, then regretted it wasn't just a dramatic phrase. It was the truth. Their regret wasn't about the words themselves. It was about the consequence they never expected. For the first time, I saw the power imbalance clearly. They had used fear of abandonment to control me, assuming I'd never risk being alone. When I did, the whole structure collapsed. Days passed. The calls became less frantic, but more emotional. My mother started leaving voice notes that sounded softer, almost childlike. She talked about memories from my childhood, about trips we took, about how close we used to be. Listening to them felt like emotional whiplash. Part of me missed her. Another part felt manipulated. I realized that two things could be true at once. She could love me, and she could hurt me. Accepting that was none of the hardest lessons of my life. I decided to speak to her directly, but on my terms. I called one afternoon when I felt steady enough to handle whatever came. She answered immediately, her voice breaking as soon as she heard mine. She said she'd been so afraid something had happened to me. I told her calmly that I was safe. Then I told her that what she said in that voicemail changed something between us. There was a long pause. She said she was just trying to teach me a lesson. That phrase made my stomach drop. I told her I wasn't a child to be taught lessons through abandonment. The conversation was painful, slow, and messy. She cried. She defended herself. She blamed stress, fear, her own upbringing. At one point, she said she thought I was choosing strangers over my family. I told her I was choosing myself. That sentence felt like stepping into sunlight after years in a dim room. This was the moment the estranged child family story became real. We were no longer pretending everything was fine. When we hung up, I felt exhausted but lighter. Nothing was resolved, but something important had shifted. I had spoken my truth without yelling, without apologizing for existing. That night, I slept deeply for the first time since the voicemail. The missed calls stopped. The silence that followed was different from the first one. It wasn't threatening. It was space. Over the next few weeks, I began to build a life that felt like mine. I decorated my apartment without worrying what she'd say. I made plans without asking permission. I noticed how often I reached for my phone to share something with her, then stopped myself. The absence was painful, but it was honest. This toxic family regret story wasn't just theirs, it was mine too. I grieved the mother I wish I'd had, not just the one I did. Eventually, my mother sent one final message that month. It was simple. I'm trying to understand. I don't want to lose you. For the first time, it didn't feel like a trap. It felt uncertain, vulnerable. I didn't rush to respond. I knew that whatever happened next would shape our relationship forever. The voicemail that changed my life had forced us both to confront uncomfortable truths, and as much as it hurt, I knew I couldn't unlearn what I had discovered about myself. I stared at my mother's last message for a long time before responding. I don't want to lose you. Those words were heavy, not because they were dramatic, but because they were new. For most of my life, the unspoken rule had been that I was the one who could be lost, replaced, corrected. Now, for the first time, she was acknowledging the possibility that I might walk away for real. I typed back slowly, choosing each word with care. I told her that I didn't want to be lost either, but that I needed respect, not fear, to be part of her life. I said that if we were going to move forward, it couldn't be the way things had always been. Her reply didn't come immediately. In fact, it didn't come at all that day. The waiting stirred up old anxieties, the familiar fear that I'd said too much, that I'd crossed another invisible line. But instead of panicking, I tried something different. I sat with the discomfort. I reminded myself that I was allowed to have needs. That was still a radical idea for me. In the days that followed, I began to notice how deeply my family dynamics had shaped my inner voice. Every decision, even small ones, came with a whisper of doubt asking what my mother would think. Choosing what to eat, what to wear, how to spend my weekend, all felt like quiet acts of rebellion. This was more than a family abandoned me story. It was a story about unlearning guilt, unlearning obedience, unlearning the belief that love had to hurt to be real. My mother eventually suggested we meet in person. She said she wanted to talk face to face to clear the air. The thought made my stomach twist. Part of me longed for the familiarity of our kitchen table, for the illusion that we could go back to how things were. Another part of me was afraid that being in her presence would pull me right back into old patterns. After a lot of thought, I agreed, but I suggested a neutral place, a small cafe near my apartment. Setting that boundary felt like another quiet victory. The day of the meeting, I arrived early. I chose a table near the window and ordered tea, something warm to steady my hands. When she walked in, I barely recognized her at first. She looked smaller somehow, less certain. She smiled when she saw me, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. We hugged briefly, awkwardly, the way strangers do when they're trying to remember how to be family. She started talking right away, filling the space with words about how hard the past weeks had been, how she'd felt like she was losing control of her own life. I listened, really listened, but I noticed how often her sentences circled back to her pain. When there was a pause, I took a breath and told her how that voicemail made me feel. I told her that being told not to come back felt like being disowned, like being erased from my own family. This mother told me not to come back story wasn't just an anecdote, it was a wound. She looked genuinely surprised. She said she'd never meant it that way, that in her mind it was a threat she expected me to challenge, not accept. Hearing that confirmed something important. She had underestimated me. She had assumed my dependence would override my dignity. I told her that I had spent one night believing I no longer had a home and that it changed how I saw her forever. The conversation was uneven. There were moments of softness, moments where she admitted she was afraid of losing influence over me. There were also moments where she slipped into old habits, framing her control as protection, her anger as love. I didn't interrupt. I let her speak, then I spoke too. For the first time, it felt like a conversation instead of a lecture. At one point, she asked if I was coming home. The question hung between us like a test. I answered honestly. I said no, not right now. I told her that I needed to build my own life without feeling like I was betraying my family. Her face fell, and I felt a familiar surge of guilt, but I stayed with my answer. This was the heart of our emotional mother-daughter story, two women trying to redefine a bond that had always been unequal. When we parted, nothing was resolved neatly. There were no promises of change, no dramatic apologies, but there was a shift. She hugged me a little tighter this time and said she needed to think. As I watched her walk away, I realized how much I'd grown in such a short time. I had survived the worst thing she could threaten me with. That knowledge gave me strength. In the weeks after our meeting, contact became sporadic but calmer. She no longer called in a panic. When she did reach out, it was with updates, not demands. I noticed how my own responses changed. I no longer felt the urge to explain or justify every choice. This was what healing looked like, I realized. Not perfection, but progress. One evening, as I was cooking dinner, my phone rang. It was my mother again. She sounded hesitant. She said she'd been thinking about our conversation, about the voicemail, about how easily words could become weapons. She didn't say the word sorry outright, but she said she regretted saying what she did. Parents' regret after kicking me out isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it comes in small, careful sentences. After we hung up, I sat down on my couch and let myself cry. Not because everything was fixed, but because something inside me had softened. I wasn't carrying the weight alone anymore. This estranged child family story wasn't ending in total separation, but it also wasn't snapping back into old patterns. It was becoming something new, something fragile but real. I began to understand that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean inviting harm back into my life. The voicemail that changed my life had forced me to grow up in ways I hadn't expected. It had taught me that love without respect isn't love at all. As the months passed, I noticed how often friends came to me with similar stories. Mothers who couldn't let go, families who used guilt as glue. I realized how common this pain was, how many people were quietly carrying it. Sharing my story felt less like exposure and more like release. This emotional, real-life family regret story wasn't just mine anymore. It was part of a larger conversation about boundaries and healing. Looking back, sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd called her back that night, if I'd gone home like she expected. I know the answer now. Nothing would have changed. Sometimes it takes walking away for someone to realize what they're about to lose. And sometimes walking away is how you finally find yourself. After that conversation, something settled into place inside me, like a door quietly closing behind my old life. The chaos had faded, but the aftermath lingered. Healing didn't arrive as a single moment of relief. It came in waves, some gentle, some unexpectedly sharp. I learned quickly that distance from my family didn't mean freedom from their influence. Their voices still echoed in my head, shaping my reactions long after the calls had slowed. I started therapy a few weeks later, something I'd never considered before because it had always been dismissed in my family as unnecessary, even indulgent. Sitting across from a stranger and telling her about the voicemail felt surreal. When I said the words out loud, "My mother told me not to come back," my throat tightened. Hearing myself say it made it real in a way it hadn't been before. The therapist didn't rush to explain or justify anything. She simply asked how it made me feel. That question alone felt revolutionary. Through those sessions, I began to understand how deeply I'd internalized responsibility for my mother's emotions. I had grown up believing it was my job to keep her calm, to anticipate her needs, to smooth over her disappointments. The voicemail shattered that illusion. It showed me that no matter how careful I was, her reactions were never truly in my control. This realization was painful, but it was also freeing. At home, I noticed small changes in myself. I laughed more easily. I slept better. I stopped jumping every time my phone buzzed. When my mother did reach out, I felt less urgency to respond immediately. Space had given me clarity. I could finally see our relationship without the fog of fear. This wasn't just a toxic family regret story. It was a story of awakening. One afternoon, my father came to visit. It was the first time I'd seen him since everything happened. He looked older, his shoulders slumped in a way I'd never noticed before. We sat across from each other in my living room, the space still feeling new and fragile. He apologized in his quiet way, saying he wished he'd spoken up sooner. I believed him, but I also saw how deeply he was still tied to my mother's emotional gravity. I realized that loving him didn't mean excusing his silence. We talked about the night of the voicemail. He admitted he'd heard my mother leave it and hadn't stopped her. He said he didn't think she meant it. Hearing that stung, but it also confirmed something important. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a pattern everyone had enabled. For the first time, I didn't rush to comfort him. I let him sit with his regret. After he left, I cried again, but it was a different kind of crying. It wasn't desperate or panicked. It was cleansing. I was grieving the parents I needed but never had. Acknowledging that loss felt like honoring my own experience instead of minimizing it. My mother and I continued speaking occasionally, carefully. She tried, in her way, to respect my boundaries. Sometimes she succeeded, sometimes she slipped, making comments about how she missed the old me, the obedient version who never pushed back. Each time, I gently but firmly reminded her that I was still the same person, just no longer afraid. Those moments were tense, but they were also honest. One evening, she asked if I remembered the day she taught me how to ride a bike. She laughed softly, recalling how she'd run behind me, hands hovering just in case I fell. That memory surprised me. It was tender, unguarded. For a moment, I saw the version of her that loved me without conditions. That moment didn't erase the pain, but it complicated it. Healing, I learned, is rarely simple. It's holding both the good and the bad without letting either define the whole story. As time went on, the narrative around my leaving began to shift within the family. What had once been whispered as rebellion slowly became reframed as independence. Relatives stopped calling to pressure me. Some even admitted they admired my courage. Hearing that felt strange, almost undeserved. I didn't feel brave. I felt exhausted. But maybe courage sometimes looks like choosing rest over endurance. I also began to reflect on how the voicemail had affected my sense of self-worth. For years, I'd measured my value by my usefulness to my family. Now I was learning to measure it by how aligned I felt with my own values. This shift didn't happen overnight. There were days when guilt crept back in, whispering that I was selfish, ungrateful. On those days, I reminded myself of the facts. A loving parent doesn't threaten abandonment to maintain control. Saying that out loud helped anchor me. One particularly quiet night, I replayed the voicemail one last time. I hadn't listened to it since the morning after it arrived. Hearing it again months later felt different. The words were the same, but I wasn't. Instead of pain, I felt distance. That voicemail no longer defined me. It marked a turning point, a before and after. The voicemail that changed my life had lost its power over my emotions, but not its lesson. I deleted the recording after that. It wasn't an act of forgiveness or denial. It was an act of closure. I didn't need proof anymore. I trusted my memory. I trusted myself. As my relationship with my mother slowly recalibrated, I noticed something unexpected. She began to change too, in small ways. She asked instead of assumed. She listened more than she spoke. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was real. Parents' regret after kicking me out didn't come as a dramatic confession. It came as effort, as restraint, as learning to sit with discomfort. One day, she told me she'd started talking to a friend about what happened. She admitted she'd been afraid of losing me, afraid of becoming irrelevant in my life. Hearing that softened something in me. Fear, I realized, had been driving both of us just in different directions. Naming it took some of its power. I didn't move back home. I never planned to, but I did visit, slowly, on my terms. The first time I walked through that front door again, my heart raced. The house smelled the same, looked the same, but I wasn't. I stayed only a few hours. When I left, no one tried to stop me. That, more than any apology, told me how much it changed. This estranged child family story didn't end with total reconciliation or permanent distance. It ended with boundaries, with choice, with the understanding that love doesn't require erasing yourself. The journey was still ongoing, but I finally felt like I was walking it as an equal, not a subordinate. And as I drove away that evening, I realized something profound. The night my mother told me not to come back, she thought she was taking power from me. In reality, she handed it over. Life didn't suddenly become easy after that first visit back home, but it became clearer. Clarity has a way of changing how you move through the world. I noticed it in the way I spoke, the way I made decisions, even the way I stood when I walked into a room. I was no longer bracing myself for disapproval. That alone felt like a quiet miracle. My mother and I settled into a new rhythm, one that was cautious but intentional. We talked once or twice a week instead of every day. Conversations stayed light at first. Weather, work, distant relatives. When topics drifted toward old expectations, I gently redirected them. Sometimes she caught herself and stopped. Other times I had to remind her. Each reminder felt awkward, but it also felt necessary. This was what protecting myself looked like. There were moments when I missed the intensity of our old dynamic, as strange as that sounds. When your whole life has been shaped around managing someone else's emotions, calm can feel unfamiliar, even empty. I had to learn that peace doesn't need to be earned through conflict. It can simply exist. One afternoon, my mother asked if she could come see my apartment. The request surprised me. Before, she'd insisted that my place was temporary, a phase I've outgrown. Now she asked as if acknowledging that this life was real. I hesitated, then agreed. When she arrived, she walked through the room slowly, touching the backs of chairs, looking at the pictures on the wall. She said it felt like me. That comment stayed with me longer than anything else she said that day. We sat on my couch, and she asked how I'd been sleeping. It was such a simple question, but it caught me off guard. I told her the truth. I said I slept better now. She nodded, her eyes lingering on her hands. She didn't say anything else, but I could tell she was thinking about that night, about the voicemail, about everything that followed. Silence between us used to feel threatening. Now it felt like space for reflection. As months passed, I started noticing changes in other areas of my life too. I became more honest in my friendships. I stopped over-explaining my choices. I learned to say no without feeling like I had to justify it. The confidence I'd built with my family began to spill outward, reshaping how I saw myself. This wasn't just recovery from a family abandoned me story. It was a redefinition of my identity. There were still hard days. Holidays were especially complicated. The first one I spent partly with my family and partly alone felt bittersweet. I left early before tension could build. When my mother hugged me goodbye, she didn't ask why I was leaving. She just said, "Drive safe." That small restraint felt like progress. Around that time, my mother finally acknowledged the voicemail directly. We were sitting at the kitchen table, the same one where so many arguments had begun and ended. She said she wished she could take those words back. She said she hadn't realized how deeply they would cut. Hearing that didn't erase the pain, but it validated it. It was the closest thing to an apology I was likely to get, and I accepted it for what it was. I told her that night changed me, that being told not to come back forced me to see our relationship clearly. I said I wasn't angry anymore, but I couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. She listened without interrupting. That alone felt like a breakthrough. Parents' regret after kicking me out isn't always about grand gestures. Sometimes it's about finally listening. After that conversation, something shifted again. She stopped using guilt as currency, not entirely, but noticeably. When she felt herself slipping, she'd catch it and change direction. Watching her try was both humbling and heartbreaking. Change is hard at any age, and I could see how much fear she was working through. I also began to understand her in new ways. She'd grown up in a household where love was conditional, where obedience was survival. Control was the only language she knew. That understanding didn't excuse her behavior, but it contextualized it. It helped me let go of the need to vilify her to justify my pain. Healing didn't require choosing villains, it required choosing myself. One evening, she told me she'd been afraid that if she didn't hold on too tightly, I'd drift away and forget her. I told her gently that holding on too tightly was what almost made that happen. The truth landed between us, quiet but undeniable. That was the core lesson of our story. Love can't be forced, it can only be offered. As our relationship stabilized, I felt ready to look back on the entire journey without flinching. The voicemail that changed my life had set everything in motion, but it wasn't the villain of the story. It was a catalyst. Without it, I might have stayed trapped in the same cycle for years. That realization filled me with a strange gratitude, not for the pain, but for the growth it demanded. I started sharing my experience more openly, and I was overwhelmed by how many people recognized themselves in it. Strangers told me about mothers who used silence as punishment, about families who equated love with control. Hearing those stories reinforced something important. This emotional, real-life family regret story wasn't rare, it was painfully common. One night, as I lay in bed, I thought about the version of myself who listened to that voicemail for the first time. She was scared, exhausted, and convinced she was alone. I wished I could reach back through time and tell her what I know now, that she would survive, that she would grow, that she would build a life where love didn't come with ultimatums. The journey wasn't over. Relationships evolve, boundaries need maintenance, and healing isn't linear. But I was no longer afraid of losing myself to keep others comfortable. That fear had lost its grip. And in that quiet confidence, I found something I'd been searching for my whole life, a sense of belonging that didn't depend on approval, a home that existed inside me. With time, the sharp edges of the past began to soften, but they never fully disappeared. Instead, they became reminders, subtle markers of where I'd been and how far I'd come. I learned that healing isn't about erasing scars, it's about learning how to live comfortably with them. Some days were calm and grounded. Other days, a single comment or memory could still knock the air out of my lungs. But the difference now was that I trusted myself to recover. My relationship with my mother entered a quieter phase. We were no longer circling the same arguments, but we weren't pretending they'd never happened either. There was an unspoken understanding between us, a fragile truce built on mutual caution. I noticed that she chose her words more carefully. When she felt the urge to advise or criticize, she often stopped herself. That restraint spoke louder than any apology could have. I also noticed how my own reactions had changed. Where I once would have braced for impact, I now listened with curiosity. When something crossed a boundary, I addressed it calmly instead of swallowing it whole. That shift felt like reclaiming my voice after years of whispering. This was what growth looked like in practice, not dramatic, but steady. One weekend, my mother invited me to a family gathering. The invitation came with no pressure, no guilt-laced undertones, just an offer. I took a long time deciding whether to go. Family events had always been minefields, places where old roles resurfaced effortlessly. In the end, I agreed, but I promised myself I would leave the moment I felt uncomfortable. Giving myself that permission changed everything. The gathering was surprisingly peaceful. Relatives greeted me warmly, some with curiosity, others with quiet respect. I sensed that my absence had shifted how they saw me. I was no longer the predictable daughter who could be counted on to fall back into line. I was someone who had drawn a line and held it. That realization altered the dynamic in subtle but meaningful ways. At one point, a cousin pulled me aside and told me she admired what I'd done. She said she wished she'd had the courage to stand up to her own parents years ago. Her words stayed with me. They reminded me that personal boundaries don't exist in isolation. When one person breaks a cycle, it sends ripples through the whole system. Later that evening, my mother and I found ourselves alone in the kitchen. She looked around, then at me, and said the house felt different without me living there. Not empty, just different. There was no accusation in her voice, only observation. I told her my life felt different too, fuller in ways I hadn't expected. We stood there for a moment, sharing that quiet truth. As I drove home that night, I realized how much my definition of family had changed. It was no longer about proximity or obligation. It was about mutual respect and choice. This estranged child family story had taught me that distance doesn't always mean disconnection. Sometimes it's what allows a relationship to survive at all. I also began to think about forgiveness in a deeper way. For a long time, I'd believed forgiveness meant absolving someone of responsibility. Now I understood it differently. Forgiveness was about releasing myself from the constant weight of resentment. It didn't require forgetting or excusing. It required clarity, and clarity was something I finally had. My mother surprised me one afternoon by admitting she'd started reflecting on her own upbringing more seriously. She talked about her mother's harshness, about how love had always been tied to obedience in her world. Hearing her speak so openly felt like witnessing a door crack open. Generational patterns don't break easily. They resist, they cling, but awareness is where change begins. I told her gently that I appreciated her effort, but that my boundaries were non-negotiable. She nodded. There was sadness in her eyes, but also understanding. That moment felt significant. It wasn't about winning or losing, it was about redefining the rules of engagement. Outside of my family, my life continued to expand. I pursued opportunities I'd once dismissed as impractical. I made friends who knew me only as I was now, not as someone's daughter. I noticed how natural it felt to exist without constant self-monitoring. That freedom was intoxicating in the best way. Occasionally, guilt still crept in, usually late at night when old doubts resurfaced. Was I being too hard, too distant? On those nights, I reminded myself of the voicemail, of how it felt to be told not to come back, of the long night where I believed I'd lost my family. That memory grounded me. It wasn't something to dwell on, but it was something to honor. The voicemail that changed my life had become a reference point, a reminder of what happens when control is mistaken for love. It taught me that boundaries aren't acts of rebellion, they're acts of self-preservation. Without them, love suffocates instead of supporting. As the year went on, my mother and I reached a new equilibrium. We laughed more, we argued less. When disagreements arose, they were handled with words instead of threats. It wasn't perfect, but it was healthier. Parents' regret after kicking me out didn't erase the damage, but it opened the door to repair. I also found myself reflecting on the concept of home. For so long, home had been a place I returned to for approval. Now it was a state of being, a sense of safety I carried with me. That shift was profound. It meant that no one could take it away with a single sentence or voicemail. Looking back, I understood that the real transformation hadn't happened in my mother or my family, it had happened in me. I had learned to trust my own judgment, to listen to my own needs, to believe that I was worthy of love that didn't require shrinking. This emotional, real-life family regret story wasn't about cutting ties or winning arguments. It was about choosing growth over comfort, about breaking a cycle quietly without spectacle. And as I moved forward, I carried that lesson with me, knowing it would shape every relationship I built from that moment on. By the time another year passed, the story of that voicemail had stopped feeling raw and started feeling instructive. It no longer replayed in my mind as an open wound, but as a turning point I could examine without flinching. I noticed how often I used it as a quiet compass when new challenges appeared in my life. Whenever I felt the familiar pull to overextend, to please, to abandon myself for harmony, I remembered that night and the clarity it forced upon me. My mother and I continued to navigate our relationship with care. There were still moments when her old instincts surfaced, when she tried to advise instead of ask, to guide instead of listen. But now I recognized those moments quickly. I named them without accusation. Sometimes she bristled, sometimes she apologized. Either way, I no longer carried the burden alone. This emotional mother-daughter story had matured into something less dramatic, but more honest. One afternoon, she asked me a question that surprised us both. She asked if I felt safe with her now. The word safe lingered between us. No one in my family had ever framed our relationship that way. I took my time answering. I told her I felt safer than before, but that safety was something we were still building. I explained that trust doesn't return all at once. It grows through consistency. She nodded, absorbing that truth with visible effort. That conversation stayed with me for days. It made me realize how much language matters. For years, our family had talked about loyalty, respect, and duty, but never safety. No one had asked whether love felt secure or conditional. Naming that gap felt like shining a light into a room that had always been dim. It wasn't comfortable, but it was necessary. As I grew more secure in myself, I also began to recognize how the past had shaped my romantic relationships. I had a pattern of overgiving, of confusing intensity with intimacy. The same fear of abandonment that had ruled my relationship with my mother had quietly followed me into adulthood. Acknowledging that wasn't easy, but it was empowering. Awareness gave me choice. I started setting boundaries in all areas of my life, not just with my family. I said no to projects that drained me. I stopped explaining my decisions to people who weren't affected by them. Each small act reinforced the same lesson. I was allowed to take up space. This wasn't selfishness, it was survival. Around this time, my mother shared something deeply personal. She told me she'd spoken to her own sister about the voicemail and the fallout that followed. She admitted she'd been embarrassed, not by her pain, but by her behavior. Hearing that made me pause. Shame can be destructive, but it can also be a catalyst for change. I told her I appreciated her honesty. It felt like another brick laid in the foundation of something sturdier than what we'd had before. We didn't suddenly become close in the way movies portray reconciliation. There were no long heart-to-heart talks late into the night. Instead, there were small, consistent moments of respect. She asked before giving advice. She accepted when I said no. She didn't weaponize silence when she was upset. These changes might have looked insignificant from the outside, but to me they were monumental. One day, she casually mentioned that she'd saved my number under a new name in her phone. Curious, I asked what it was. She said she'd changed it from my daughter to just my first name. She laughed nervously, unsure how I'd react. I surprised myself by crying. That simple change symbolized something profound. She was learning to see me as an individual, not an extension of herself. I realized then how much of our conflict had been about identity. For years, my role had been fixed and unquestioned. The voicemail shattered that role. It forced us both to confront who I was becoming and who she needed to be to remain part of my life. This wasn't just a family rejection, then regret story. It was a story of transformation on both sides. As my sense of self stabilized, I felt an urge to give back in some way. I began volunteering with a support group focused on adult children of controlling parents. Listening to others share their stories was both heartbreaking and validating. The themes were eerily similar: conditional love, fear disguised as concern, boundaries labeled as betrayal. Each story reminded me how common this pain was and how quietly it was endured. I shared my experience when it felt appropriate, not as a cautionary tale, but as proof that change was possible. I emphasized that walking away didn't always mean permanent loss. Sometimes it was the only path to mutual respect. Not everyone's story ended with reconciliation, and that was okay too. Healing doesn't follow a single script. There were still moments when grief surfaced unexpectedly. Seeing mothers and daughters who seemed effortlessly close could sting. On those days, I allowed myself to mourn what I didn't have without diminishing what I did. Comparison no longer consumed me the way it once did. I understood now that every relationship carries its own history and weight. One evening, my mother called just to tell me she'd tried a new recipe and thought I'd like it. No agenda, no advice, just sharing. After we hung up, I sat quietly, feeling a gentle warmth settle in my chest. That call meant me more than any dramatic apology ever could. It was proof of change in action. The voicemail that changed my life had once felt like an ending. Now I saw it as an interruption, a hard stop that forced a rewrite. It challenged every assumption I'd held about love, loyalty, and family. In doing so, it gave me something invaluable: the freedom to choose myself without apology. As I moved forward, I carried that lesson with care. I knew there would be future conflicts, future misunderstandings. Growth doesn't eliminate struggle, it changes how you meet it. I no longer feared losing love for speaking my truth. I understood that love worth keeping could withstand honesty. This estranged child family story had evolved into something quieter and deeper. It wasn't about winning or proving a point, it was about becoming whole. And as I reflected on everything that had happened, I felt a steady confidence take root. No matter what came next, I knew who I was, and that knowledge was something no voicemail could ever take away. As more time passed, the intensity of everything that had happened settled into something like perspective. The story no longer lived only in my emotions, it lived in my understanding. I could trace the arc now, from the moment my mother left that voicemail to the person I had become because of it. Seeing it clearly didn't make the past painless, but it made it meaningful. My mother and I developed a rhythm that felt sustainable. We spoke without the undercurrent of fear that used to dominate our conversations. When tension arose, it was addressed instead of buried. That alone changed everything. I began to trust that disagreements wouldn't automatically lead to withdrawal or punishment. Trust, I learned, grows when fear loses its place at the center. One afternoon, she asked if I would help her sort through some old boxes in the attic. The request surprised me, not because it was demanding, but because it felt collaborative. I agreed, curious about what the task might uncover. The attic was filled with memories layered in dust and time. Old photographs, school projects, handwritten letters. We moved slowly, sharing stories as we went. At one point, she pulled out a photo of me as a child, smiling wide, unaware of the weight adulthood would bring. She held it for a long moment before handing it to me. She said quietly that she missed that version of me sometimes. I told her I missed that version too, but that she grew into someone strong and self-aware. That exchange felt important. It acknowledged loss without blame. Sorting through those boxes felt symbolic. We were sifting through the past, deciding what to keep and what to let go. Not everything needed to be preserved. Some things had served their purpose and could be released. That realization mirrored my own healing process. I didn't need to carry every memory forward. I could choose which ones shaped my future. Later that day, my mother surprised me by apologizing outright. She didn't qualify it or soften it. She said she was sorry for using fear to control me. She said she was sorry for the voicemail. Hearing those words felt surreal. I didn't rush to respond. I let them settle. When I finally spoke, I thanked her for saying it. Forgiveness didn't arrive in a rush, but it came gently, like a door opening rather than slamming shut. That apology didn't erase the past, but it allowed us to move forward without pretending it hadn't happened. Parents' regret after kicking me out had finally found its voice, not in desperation or panic, but in accountability. That distinction mattered more than I'd ever expected. As our relationship grew steadier, I noticed how my inner world continued to shift. I felt more grounded, less reactive. Situations that once would have sent me spiraling now felt manageable. I attributed that change not just to time, but to the confidence that came from choosing myself when it mattered most. I also reflected on how easily love can become entangled with control when fear goes unexamined. My mother's fear of losing me had driven her to push me away, a contradiction I still found heartbreaking. Understanding that paradox didn't excuse her behavior, but it helped me hold compassion without surrendering my boundaries. I began writing more during this period, journaling late into the night, unpacking layers I hadn't known were there. Writing became a way to integrate the experience, to turn pain into insight. Each page reminded me that my voice mattered, that my story deserved to be told honestly. Sharing pieces of my journey with others continued to bring unexpected connections. People confided in me about their own family struggles, about voicemails and ultimatums and silences that echoed my own. It reinforced the truth that these stories aren't isolated. They're woven into many lives, often hidden behind smiles and holiday photos. One evening, my mother called to tell me she'd set boundaries with a relative for the first time in her life. She sounded nervous but proud. Hearing that made me smile. Change, it seemed, was contagious. When one person breaks a pattern, it creates space for others to do the same. We talked about that, about how generational cycles persist until someone chooses differently. She admitted that watching me leave had forced her to confront fears she'd been avoiding for decades. That confession was humbling. It reframed our conflict not as a battle, but as a catalyst for mutual growth. I thought often about the night everything changed, the quiet after the voicemail, the decision not to call back. At the time, it felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. Now I saw it as a doorway. Walking through it had been terrifying, but it led me somewhere more honest than I'd ever been. The voicemail that changed my life no longer felt like a threat or a wound. It felt like a marker, a line between who I was and who I became. It taught me that love rooted in fear cannot sustain itself, but love rooted in respect can evolve. As I looked ahead, I felt a sense of calm confidence. I knew there would be challenges, both within my family and beyond it, but I also knew I had the tools to face them. I had learned to listen to myself, to trust my instincts, to speak my truth even when my voice shook. This emotional, real-life family regret story wasn't about perfect endings. It was about honest ones. It was about learning that sometimes the most painful moments are the ones that leak us up. And as I continued to build a life aligned with my values, I carried that lesson with gratitude. The past no longer defined me, but it informed me. And in that balance, I found a peace that felt earned, not given. A peace that came from knowing that no matter what words were spoken in anger or fear, my worth was never up for negotiation. As life moved forward, the story of my family became less about conflict and more about maintenance. Healing, I learned, isn't a destination you arrive at and unpack forever. It's an ongoing practice, something you return to again and again as circumstances change. What had once felt like a crisis had become a reference point, a quiet reminder of how quickly things can unravel when fear takes the lead. My mother and I continued to build something new, but neither of us pretended it was effortless. There were still misunderstandings, moments when old habits tried to resurface. The difference was that we named them now. When tension crept in, we didn't let it fester into silence or explode into ultimatums. We talked, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes emotionally, but always honestly. One conversation in particular stayed with me. We were discussing a decision I'd made about my career, one she didn't fully understand. I could hear the familiar concern in her voice, the impulse to steer me back toward what felt safe to her. Before she could finish, she stopped herself and asked, "Do you want my opinion or do you just want me to listen?" That question felt monumental. It showed how far we'd both come. I told her I just needed her to listen, and she did. After we hung up, I sat quietly, letting that moment sink in. It wasn't dramatic or emotional on the surface, but it represented a complete shift in our dynamic. Respect had replaced control. Choice had replaced obligation. This emotional mother-daughter story had finally found a healthier language. Outside my family, I noticed how much easier it was to recognize red flags in other relationships. I no longer dismissed discomfort as something I needed to endure. When people crossed boundaries, I addressed it early. When connections felt draining, I stepped back without guilt. The growth that began with my family had transformed how I navigated the world. I also became more aware of the grief that still lingered beneath the surface. Healing doesn't erase loss, it reframes it. There were moments when I mourned the years spent shrinking myself, the opportunities I'd passed up out of fear. On those days, I allowed myself to grieve without judgment. That compassion extended inward was something I'd never learned growing up. My mother shared with me that she sometimes felt ashamed of how she'd acted. She worried that I'd never fully forgive her. I told her forgiveness wasn't a finish line, it was something that evolved as trust was rebuilt. I explained that what mattered most was consistency, not perfection. She seemed relieved by that, as if the pressure to be redeemed all at once had been lifted. One evening, we revisited the voicemail one last time, not the recording itself, but the moment. She asked what I'd felt that night. I told her honestly. I told her about the shock, the numbness, the grief. I told her how I'd believed, for a few hours, that I no longer had a family. Hearing that, her eyes filled with tears. She said she'd never imagined that outcome. That admission didn't undo the pain, but it closed a loop that had been open for a long time. I realized then that this family rejection then regret story wasn't about assigning blame. It was about understanding impact. Intent and impact are not the same, and learning that difference had changed both of us. It allowed us to hold accountability without destroying the possibility of connection. As time went on, I found myself thinking less about what my family expected and more about what I wanted to build. I envisioned a future rooted in mutual respect, whether that included my family in every detail or not. I understood now that closeness isn't measured by frequency or intensity, but how safe it feels to be yourself. The voicemail that changed my life had forced me to confront a hard truth. Love that depends on fear will always demand more than it gives. Letting go of that kind of love was painful, but it made room for something healthier to grow. That lesson stayed with me, shaping every meaningful connection I formed afterward. I also noticed how my mother began to speak differently about me to others. She no longer framed my choices as rebellious or confusing. She spoke with pride, even when she didn't fully understand my path. Hearing that from relatives felt strange, almost surreal. It was as if the narrative around me had finally caught up to the reality I'd been living. Looking back, I understood that my decision not to go back that night wasn't just about self-preservation, it was an act of truth. It forced everyone involved to face realities they'd been avoiding. That kind of honesty is disruptive, but it's also transformative. I often think about people who might be standing at a similar crossroads, listening to a voicemail, reading a message, feeling their world tilt. I wish they knew what I know now, that choosing yourself doesn't automatically mean losing everything. Sometimes it's the only way to find what's real. This emotional, real-life family regret story had taught me that boundaries are not walls meant to punish others. They're structures that protect what matters. Without them, relationships collapse under the weight of unspoken expectations. As the year drew to a close, I felt a deep sense of gratitude, not for the pain, but for the growth that demanded. I was no longer defined by my family's approval or disapproval. I was defined by my values, my choices, my resilience. The night my mother told me not to come back felt like the end of something essential. In truth, it was the beginning of a life lived with intention. And as I stepped into that life, I carried with me a quiet confidence, knowing that no matter what happened next, I had already survived the hardest goodbye. By the time I reached this stage in my life, I could see how the ripple effects of that one voicemail had reshaped everything. It wasn't just about my relationship with my mother. It had influenced how I interacted with everyone, friends, colleagues, romantic partners. Boundaries, once terrifying, had become a kind of armor, and I realized that armor didn't isolate me. Instead, it allowed me to show up fully, authentically, without fear. One afternoon, I received a call from my mother. Her voice sounded softer than usual, calmer, almost tentative. She asked if she could come over to my apartment for dinner. I hesitated for a moment, not because I didn't want to see her, but because I remembered all the times closeness had been tied to tension. But this time, something felt different. I said yes. I set the expectation that it would be a low-pressure visit, and she agreed. That was the first time in years I felt a visit might actually be normal. She arrived carrying a small casserole, fumbling slightly as if she feared she might upset the delicate balance we had established. We laughed about small things, like the way she always insisted on rearranging my furniture to make it more comfortable, even though I had designed the space to suit me. The air felt lighter than I expected. We shared stories, jokes, memories, and for a moment it almost felt like nothing had gone wrong. But I reminded myself that this wasn't about erasing the past. It was about building something new with awareness. Later, after she left, I reflected on how much our dynamic had changed. She no longer dominated conversations with advice or criticism. She listened, really listened when I spoke. When she felt the impulse to intervene, she paused and asked first. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. That small shift in her behavior was proof that boundaries had impact, not only on the person enforcing them, but on the other person as well. I started to notice other subtle shifts in our relationship. She began including me in family decisions in a new way, not as an obligation, but as someone whose voice mattered. She stopped using guilt to coerce compliance. She didn't always succeed, but the effort mattered more than perfection. Parents' regret after kicking me out often surfaces as sporadic attempts, not grand gestures. I had to learn to recognize those small attempts as meaningful without letting old patterns pull me back in. Outside my family, I also noticed changes in my friendships. I no longer tolerated manipulation or conditional affection. When someone tried to control me or guilt me, I recognized it immediately and responded in real time. The lessons from my mother had become universal in my life. Love doesn't demand obedience, and respect is non-negotiable. One day I found myself reflecting on the most painful night, the night I received that voicemail. I remembered the fear, the heartbreak, and the way my entire sense of home had shattered in an instant. At the time, I felt powerless. Now, I saw that moment as a crucible. It forced me to see my worth outside of my family's approval. It forced me to build resilience. That night had given me agency, even if I hadn't realized it at the time. Around that same period, my mother and I had another honest conversation. She admitted that she had feared losing me permanently, that she regretted her words every single day since. She told me that watching me stand firm, refusing to come back under duress, had been painful, but also enlightening for her. For the first time, she recognized the difference between control and love. Hearing her speak that way felt like a bridge being built, plank by plank, over waters that at once felt impossible to cross. I told her that healing didn't mean forgetting, that I wasn't asking her to erase the past, but I needed acknowledgement, accountability, and consistency. She agreed, understanding that those weren't negotiable, and in that acknowledgement there was a release. Not for her, but for both of us. We could finally relate to one another as humans, not as adversaries bound by fear and expectation. I also started to reflect on my own growth in a more intentional way. I had developed a sense of self that wasn't defined by obedience or approval. I recognized when fear tried to creep back in, whether in family interactions or other relationships. I had tools now, self-awareness, verbal boundaries, and the ability to sit with discomfort without capitulating. These tools were hard-earned, and I reminded myself not to take them lightly. One quiet evening, I replayed the sequence of events in my mind: the voicemail, the night of despair, the long walk of self-assertion, the conversations that followed, the rebuilding. It all formed a narrative I could tell with clarity and honesty. The story of being told not to come back had shifted from a mark of shame to a badge of survival. I had moved from victimhood to agency. I also began sharing pieces of my journey with a few trusted friends, not as therapy, but as reflection. They often told me they recognized themselves in my story, the guilt, the fear, the struggle to assert independence against loved ones. I realized that my experience wasn't unique. Many people were silently navigating the same terrain, wondering if standing up for themselves meant losing family entirely. I wanted them to know that it didn't have to be that way. During one of these conversations, a friend asked me how I had managed to keep the relationship with my mother intact after such a sharp rupture. I thought for a moment and realized it was simple, though not easy. Boundaries, honesty, and space. I didn't allow the past to trap me in resentment, but I didn't let guilt drive me back into old patterns either. I responded with calm clarity, and for the first time, I recognized that I had truly internalized the lesson of the voicemail that changed my life. As the months continued, our visits became easier. She stopped hovering, I stopped apologizing for existing, conversations flowed with fewer tensions, and our laughter became more genuine. It wasn't the same as before, and it didn't need to be. It was a healthier version, one built on mutual respect rather than obligation or fear. Looking back, I understood that the night I chose not to answer her voicemail was the beginning of reclaiming my life. At first, it had felt like defiance, even betrayal, but with hindsight, I saw it as an act of self-preservation and courage. That decision shaped not just my relationship with my mother, but my relationship with myself. It taught me that love can be firm, that boundaries can coexist with connection, and that healing is always possible, even from moments of deep hurt. This estranged child family story had evolved into one of growth, understanding, and cautious hope. It didn't erase the past, but it transformed how the past influenced my present. And in that transformation, I finally felt a sense of equilibrium, not perfection, not closure, but balance. For the first time in years, I felt fully seen, not as someone's extension or obligation, but as a complete, independent person. And that, more than anything, was the gift of everything that had happened. By the time I reached the final chapter of this journey, I realized the story had become bigger than just one voicemail or one night. That message my mother left, the words, "Don't come back," had once felt like a sentence, but over the months and years that followed, I understood it was more like a mirror, reflecting both my mother's fears and my own strength. It had forced me to confront truths I hadn't wanted to see, and in doing so, it reshaped the way I lived. The final months of our rebuilding brought moments I never thought possible. My mother and I laughed freely without second-guessing every word. We shared meals without tension, not simply because we avoided conflict, but because we had learned to communicate without fear. There were still disagreements, but they were managed with calm conversation rather than ultimatums. She had begun to internalize the idea that love cannot be conditional, and I had internalized the idea that my voice mattered even when it challenged her. One Sunday afternoon, she asked if I wanted to go through some old photo albums she'd found in the attic. I agreed, curious but cautious. As we flipped through pages filled with birthdays, school photos, and family vacations, I noticed something striking. For the first time, I could look at the past without wincing. I could see both the joy and the pain, and I no longer felt trapped between them. My mother and I shared quiet laughter at the silly hairstyles and awkward family portraits, and I felt a sense of warmth I hadn't thought possible after that fateful voicemail. At one point, she paused on a photo of me around 10 years old, riding my bike in the park. She remembered that day vividly, and she spoke softly, almost to herself, about how she had held me steady even when I felt scared. Listening to her recall that memory, I realized how much had been buried under years of misunderstanding and fear. That small act of recollection, so simple on the surface, carried immense weight. It was an acknowledgement of love, unspoken but undeniable. We talked about the voicemail too, not in anger, but in reflection. She admitted that in that moment she had acted out of fear, wanting to protect herself as much as control me. Hearing her articulate that gave me a deeper understanding of her own vulnerabilities. I told her that although those words had hurt me deeply, they had also forced me to stand up for myself in ways I never would have otherwise. She listened silently, her eyes glistening, and for the first time I saw her as both my parent and a human being, flawed and striving just like me. This estranged child family story had transformed into a narrative of mutual growth. We both had been shaped by fear, control, and expectation, but we had also both grown because of those struggles. I realized that love doesn't have to be perfect to be meaningful. It doesn't have to be free of mistakes. It needs only to be honest, consistent, and rooted in respect. That understanding reshaped not just my relationship with my mother, but how I approached every connection in my life. With this clarity came freedom. I started setting deeper boundaries, not just with my family, but in all areas of my life. I recognized patterns in friendships and relationships that had previously drained me. I refused to sacrifice my well-being to maintain someone else's comfort. Where I had once been hesitant, I was now confident. Where I had once accepted discomfort, I now demanded respect. This wasn't arrogance, it was self-preservation and wisdom gained through trial by fire. One evening, as we sat together, my mother reached across the table and took my hand. She told me she was proud of who I had become, proud not despite my choices, but because of the strength I had shown. I felt a lump rise in my throat. That affirmation, so long delayed, carried more weight than any earlier approval could have. It wasn't about being perfect or obedient. It was about surviving, growing, and holding my own truth. I thought about the night I received that voicemail, the 46 missed calls that followed, the fear and doubt that had consumed me. It felt like a lifetime ago. I had once imagined that standing firm would leave me alone, estranged forever from the people I loved, but in truth, it had created a space for honesty and respect. It had given both of us the chance to rebuild on more solid ground. What had seemed like rejection had been an invitation to see, to understand, to grow. In the months that followed, our interactions became more natural. We shared dinners, holidays, and small victories without tension. She stopped trying to control me and started celebrating me. And I, in turn, no longer carried resentment as a shadow in our relationship. Forgiveness had come not in a dramatic act, but in consistent, small choices. Choices to listen, to respect, to acknowledge, and to allow space. I realized that what I had learned from this experience extended beyond my family. It became a guide for my own life. When I encountered manipulation, criticism, or fear, I recognized it immediately and responded with calm boundaries. When people demanded obedience in exchange for love, I understood that I didn't have to comply. And most importantly, I realized that I could build relationships that were nurturing and reciprocal rather than transactional and fearful. Looking back, the voicemail that changed my life had once felt like a full stop, a declaration that I was no longer wanted. But in the fullness of time, it became a beginning, a catalyst for growth, courage, and self-respect. It taught me that even in the face of pain, there's an opportunity to reclaim agency, to transform relationships, and to forge a life rooted in authenticity rather than fear. The night my mother told me not to come back had been terrifying, but it had been necessary. It forced me to see the truth about our family, about her limitations, and about my own strength. That night, I had chosen myself, and every choice I made afterward built on that first act of courage. I learned that boundaries are not acts of punishment, they are acts of survival, that love cannot exist in fear, that forgiveness is not a gift to the other person, but freedom for yourself. Now, as I reflect on everything, I feel a profound sense of closure, not because the past has been erased, but because it has been understood. Not because all pain has disappeared, but because it has been transformed into wisdom. I have a family that is imperfect, yes, but more honest and respectful than it has ever been. I have a relationship with myself that is grounded, empowered, and unshakable. And for the first time in my life, I feel fully seen, fully capable, and fully free. This estranged child family story, once filled with heartbreak, rejection, and fear, has evolved into a testament to resilience and growth. It shows that even the sharpest wounds can be transformed into lessons, that love can survive honesty, and that sometimes the hardest goodbyes lead to the most meaningful reconnections. In the end, the story is not about the voicemail. It's about what that moment revealed, our capacity to endure, to assert ourselves, and to build relationships rooted in respect and truth. That lesson will remain with me forever. I have learned that standing firm, even when it's frightening, does not mean turning away from love. It means choosing the kind of love that is real, nurturing, and reciprocal. And as I move forward, I carry with me the quiet knowledge that I am no longer defined by fear, guilt, or obligation. I am defined by courage, clarity, and choice. And that, more than anything, is the life I have reclaimed.